Crank length. So how does it affect power? Now, as an example, if we had a rock in our garden that we couldn't shift, we can then go and get a crowbar and we can put a pivot point right near the rock and can we use the lever to actually move the rock. So from leverage, we can actually apply a greater force to the rock and move the rock. Now, does this apply to crank length? If we make the crank length longer, are we going to get more power? Well, let's just roll our intro and let's just see if that's actually really the case. Well, cranks come in a number of different lengths, and the standard ones are 170, 172.5 and 175. And on my look cranks, as you can see here, they actually have a little lobe that can adjust to actually adjust it to any of those crank lengths. And then we also have other crank lengths where on the track we have 165mm and 170mm sometimes, and you can also get some oddball ones for people who are very large or people who are very small. Now, with all these different crank lengths, there must be something to it. So let's just say that we extend that crank. So we actually are creating more mechanical leverage. But the problem with that is the diameter that your foot has to travel is actually longer. So the distance is longer. So to actually complete the same revolution, maintain the same cadence, because cadence by force is power, our foot speed needs to go faster. So that's the trade-off. Our foot speed's faster if we extend the crank length to get more leverage. Now, if the crank length is shorter, it's the opposite. So we have less mechanical leverage, but our foot speed's slower, so it's much easier to ride at a higher cadence. So this is where you get an advantage, you get a leverage advantage, but then your actual foot speed changes, so it's a give and take. And that's why it doesn't give you much of an advantage by changing your crank length. Plus also, the fact that we actually have different chain rings that we can change, like on a track bike, or we have a geared bike like a road bike, you can actually transfer that amount of power through that gearing system. So the cadence is actually changed on your actual crank, because cadence versus force equals your power. So the power remains the same that you're putting out at the crank anyway. So that's why crank length doesn't make much difference when it comes to a bicycle system with a chain and geared system that we have on a bicycle. Okay, well that begs the question then, why do we have different crank lengths? Why do we, have from 165mm up to, 175, even some cranks are even 185mm? Well, the reason is, it's basically about the biodynamics, how you fit on the bike, or how you want to actually seat yourself on the bike. Now, if you actually have a longer crank and you're saying, well, that's what I want, then your seat position actually has to be lower, right? So you've got a lower center of gravity. And you actually might even just like that. It might actually suit your position better. But if you go for a shorter crank, then you actually will sit higher, and then you actually don't have such a lower center of gravity, but you can actually then get a flatter back, and you can actually, because you've got less knee lift, and you can actually get in a more aerodynamic position for triathlon and TT bikes. So with crank length, it's mostly to do with the biodynamics of how the person is being fit to the bike, not so much about applying the power through the transmission to drive the bike. So in conclusion, you really can't actually look at the crank in isolation and just say, hey, look, I've got a longer crank, I'm going to have more mechanical leverage, like we did at the beginning when we had the crowbar and the pivot point and the rock, because it doesn't actually work like that in the whole combination of the way the transmission works. But if you're actually someone who wants to play around with your position on the bike and you go into a bike fitter, or you want to try and get into a more aero position, and you want to actually try different crank lengths, this is actually probably a really good way to be able to change the position on your bike, because it seems counterintuitive, but if you actually have a shorter crank, you actually sit higher. And with that sitting that higher, it puts your bum higher, and you can actually lean over, and your knee lift is a lot less. And this is probably one of the main reasons why there's been a bit of a trend, especially in the triathlon and the TT type market, that people are going for smaller cranks. Well, anyway, guys, if you've actually tried any of these things, just leave your comments down below. And what was your experiences with using different crank lengths? And anyway, guys, that's where I'm going to leave it. And I will catch you next vid. Cheers.